Fairness. I think we're very lucky to have him around here at the University of Pennsylvania as part of the seminar on freedom that we are running thanks to a generous grant from the Chaskop Foundation that made all this possible. And I think we are fortunate because of the kind of, not only the kind of topic that John is going to talk about today, but because of the ambition that he puts in the conversation that he's going to have with us today. If you go and have a look at his website, John defines himself as a fusionist. And he says that he likes to combine the uncombinables. Capitalism and democracy, private property and social justice, free market and fairness, Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. So there is really a very ambitious project behind. And I think I'm very curious about the ambitious project because so far apparently has been extremely successful. John has recently written a book which is called Free Market Fairness, which I guess is pictured in the slides behind me. And this book has been quite successful among philosophers and among social scientists as well, who are interested in the idea of justice, which is a central concept in the society we're living on at the moment. And the possibility to combine such a diverse set of instances, that is coming from the libertarian side, with instances coming from the social justice side, seems to be an important element that highlights the success of this book. Just very briefly before leaving the floor to John, I wanted to tell you that he's held positions at Princeton, Stanford, and Harvard, that has recently been named the Romeo Elton Professor of National Theology, which is another interesting aspect of his very vast and diverse curriculum. And is currently Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at Brown University. Where he runs a project which is called the Political Theory Project. Another reason why I think it's been extremely important for us to have him here, since this in some way fits into this personal freedom project that we are running here at the PPE at the University of Pennsylvania. So, John, please, I think it's your turn now, and we really look forward to your exciting projects.
Is it your tradition to clap first? I'm used to that. Thanks for coming. I'm really delighted and honored to have a chance to talk to you here at Penn. I'm a philosopher by training, and I'm going to roll some philosophy on you. I'm aware that many of you are undergrads in PPE programs, some of you who may not have had a lot of philosophy. So I'll promise you at the beginning that the philosophy I'm going to roll on you is not going to be painful. I'm going to do it really gently. It won't be painful, that is, unless you walked in here just now and are sitting there looking at me, having a political philosophy. And if you're sitting there right now, holding a political philosophy, you may find yourself begin to feel some unease and possibly even pain as I continue speaking. If you find yourself feeling that pain, do not be alarmed. You know what the Marines say, pain is only weakness leaving the body. So I believe. So for many years now, since before most of you were born, probably since before I was born, the train of liberal theorizing, that is the train in which political philosophers talk about the requirement of democratic justice and debate about ideas of freedom and the place of distributive justice in our world, that terrain has lain in a deep freeze. And the freeze and the division among the camps of philosophers mirrors a divide in our practical politics, a divide between parties of left and of right. And as I think of that divide, that great divide in the academic setting, the world that I live in, it resembles a frozen, windswept sea with two camps set up on opposite sides of this icy divide. Up one coast, we have the academically embattled camp, classical liberals and libertarians. As I picture these are my people for a very long time. As I picture my fellow classical liberals and libertarians, these erstwhile fellow classical liberals and libertarians, I picture them as hunkered down in the ice in tents, with the wind blowing really hard, flapping against the doors of the tents. But their tents are going nowhere, though the winds may howl, because they have these stakes given to them long ago by John Locke, or so they think they're given to them by John Locke, that are banged down into the ice really hard, holding those tents there. In that camp, they talk a lot about the importance of private economic freedom, personal responsibility, limited government. But in that camp, the phrase social justice is only rarely or dismissively heard. Across the windswept divide is the other camp, is the dominant camp, the academically dominant camp of the modern or egalitarian, or as Samuel Freeman coined the term that I think best describes them, the high liberals. And the high liberals, as I picture them, are not in tents, but in something like igloos blocked together mainly by this really important philosopher, John Rawls, in the early 70s. And igloos, they're still igloos, but they're a lot nicer than the tents. There's more of them too, certainly. There's a whole village of these igloos. The igloos, I picture them as being warm. They have, flat screen TV sets. They have heaters. They have furs, faux furs. But in that camp, the camp of the high liberals, their battle cry is social justice. And in most cases, in various ways, they advocate a government of expansive powers, especially in economic affairs, in pursuit of the requirements of social justice. But in that camp, words like capitalism or private economic liberty are only rarely or reluctantly discussed or affirmed. That divide between those two camps mirrors a divide. Here's our first little bit of philosophy. This works. Oops, how do I make this go on? You're going to make this step. Push this button. Maybe this way. Sorry. Okay. You can make it the whole screen. Wow. Thank you. So that divide between the two academic camps, and these academic camps, by the way, give conceptual firepower to popular political movements. For example, the tent people, they get 2 tents. Let that be. That's a small little group. They give intellectual firepower, such as it is, to some elements of the Tea Party. Not the whole package of Tea Party, but elements of the Tea Party. I think the most attractive elements of the Tea Party. So too, the high liberals give firepower, the igloo people give firepower to popular movements like Occupy Wall Street, not all the elements of Occupy, but some of what I think are the most attractive elements of Occupy. What I want to point out to you, and again, this is something that, as in so much else, I've learned from Samuel Freeman. I've been thinking this way myself for a while, but some of the stuff Samuel wrote really made me see it more clearly. This divide out here, this is the bit that I wanted you to see, this divide out here, or between these political concepts, gets its divisiveness and its intractability, in part because that divide is rooted in a prior debate, a debate that also has intractability, because it's about a question about moral personality, or a question about what kind of conception of the person do we begin when we start thinking about politics at all. So Aristotle's question is, how should people live together? That suggests that most political philosophers, on one level or another, do ask the question about what are people, after all, and how they should live together. And so what we get is, just to take a simple example, this one. This is a school, this libertarians, who I've distinguished classical liberals and libertarians. These tend to be more hardcore about property rights. These guys, Adam Smith tradition, this is Nozick, say, Rand, maybe. This people up here are people like Adam Smith. They allow a little more role for the state in terms of taxing, legitimately taxing people. But to take this example, this is a tradition, let's say, rooted in the work, I see rooted in the work, say, of John Locke, at least understood in a certain way. And John Locke says that
if you want to figure out what the state should be like, we begin with an idea of what a person is like. We imagine that person in a pre-political state, or if you like, a state of nature of a certain kind. And we strip away all these things we know about status and hierarchy and places in society, and we imagine people as we are in something like our natural condition. And on the standard reading of the Lockean text, Locke says, look, what do we find? We look that way. We look at the state of nature, we find that we are self-owners, beings who own ourselves. Since we own ourselves, you guys know the Lockean run, if you own yourselves, you own your labor too. If you own your labor, you can come to have property and things out there in the world. More than that, on the Lockean view, it looks as though private property, perhaps even extensive private ownership of property, is built into the very fabric of the universe. Because in that Lockean view, Locke views mankind and the world as God's creation. And as Locke sees it, as I read Locke, God created us, human beings, as these beings that have these interesting features. We have mouths, and we have stomachs, and our stomachs get hungry. But low out there in the world, there are things like trees that produce things like apples, such that if we go out there and pick the apple and eat the apple, it fills our stomachs. There's a kind of a God-designed connection between ourselves and things that are in the world that the institution of private property recognizes and affirms. It doesn't have to be that way. God, I suppose, could have done it differently on this viewpoint. He might have created us all as, I don't know, billiard balls with no mouths at all to sort of roll around. He could have created fruit being like the fruit that my grandmother had on her table when I was growing up, which was these cement-painted apples and things. I don't know why she had those. That were not edible. But the way God created them was there was this fit. What's more, this little blocking curlicues. The fit seems to be best for people who are very industrious, and we can sort of run towards capitalism that way. But this way of reasoning, if you think that when it comes time to ask, well, what should the state be like? We reason naturalistically, and I think the state should, in some important, maybe the most important thing that the state should do, is recognize and protect our natural rights. And so for Lockeans, or on this libertarian line, libertarian reading of Locke, when states, but sometimes about politics, one of the most important things the state should do is protect economic liberty, property. And you can do something similar up here. Just so quickly, this other the tent next door to the libertarians, the classical liberals. I think of this as a tradition running, beginning at least with, it's got some Hume in it in the background, but let's say Adam Smith. And we think of people as, in some sense, happiness maximizers. The reasoning tends to be econometric or consequentialist or ends directed. And these people, when they reason about what it means to try to satisfy the demands of happiness maximizing individuals, they tend to reason econometrically, and they think that running their economic models the way they do, that economic liberty is one of the important things the state should protect for that reason. Importantly, though, and this is the part that I want you to see, that school, that set of schools, this is kind of the paradigm, think of that, of the tent people, is different from the way people across the divide start. And across the divide, over at those igloos, and again, the igloos is like by far the dominant view in the mainstream academy. If you threw a snowball down the hallway of any leading philosophy department in the country, you couldn't help but hit a high liberal. But these people, in this school, they tend to begin someplace differently. It's a different conception of the citizen. They begin with the idea of something like a democratic citizen. And I think of this as a tradition rooted roughly in the work of Rousseau. And we can think of the citizen as a being in this tradition, not as a person owning themselves or trying to maximize happiness, but rather a being who has these two capacities or two ways of seeing the world, morally speaking. On the one hand, the citizen is thought as a being who can see that her own life is incredibly important. So you can see that the fact that she's going to live this life is really important to her, maybe infinitely important because, after all, it's her life. But along with having the capacity to see the importance of her own life, these citizens are also taken to be kinds of moral beings who can look around them and see the moral importance of each of their fellow citizens' lives. Just like their own life is important, they think, you know what, my fellow citizens' lives are important too. So in this way of beginning, we're trying to figure out, well, how do we honor those twin ways of seeing the world without one overriding the other? I mean, some people up here think that already by saying we should begin with the idea of citizens seeing the importance of other people's lives is to make these people slaves to one another. That's not the case, by the way. This view says that there are two ways of seeing the world. We're trying to reconcile and work out together and honor, maybe is a better way to say it. And the importance of your own life, also with the importance of your fellow citizens' lives, not forgetting the importance of your own life to you. And so when they reason in a different way, in part because it starts from a different place, they try to figure out, well, how do we make sense of a political structure that would honor these two powers? And when they do that, they find themselves not reasoning about the state of nature or running economic models, but rather engaging in a kind of reason, a kind of public reasoning, where they try to adjust and think about one another together, think about their situation together, and they deliberate, let's say, and they work out a system when it comes to politics that often has this feature that something like this, an acceptable political system, a political system that can be coercively enforced, should be acceptable to all the citizens who are going to live there, each and every one of them. Because after all, it's going to pick up that part about honoring the importance of your fellow citizens' lives. So they reason out, and they get something like social justice as a fundamental requirement of honoring this conception of citizenship. So the important point that I call this the moral status quo, not because it's the way it is, but because it's the way we think, we conceive of the normative possibilities right now, it seems to me. And the important point is that this divide out here, 10 people, igloo people, is in part generated, and it gets its starkness, in part because of the starkness of different starting points. And debates out here generate conclusions out that way. And when I was starting to see some of that, kind of a rough version of that kind of layout, when I was a graduate student, I got a scholarship to go to Oxford. I went to Oxford. I thought to myself, this is going to be fantastic. I'm going to get to talk to some amazing philosophers, and we're actually going to be able to talk about this stuff. And I'm going to sit with some of the smartest people in the world. We're going to actually have these conversations. And I was really surprised, naively enough, no one really wanted to talk about that. Or anytime we did talk about it, the conversations always seemed to be infected by our awareness that whoever won here was going to win up this way. I mean, there are twists you can do. You can do this and get down there by various routes, left libertarian stuff. But roughly speaking, still, these debates up here tend to run you out that way, and that, it seems to me, infected the conversation you would try to have out here. And so what we get, and this is where we are. We get a situation where there's kind of a stalemate with these two basic divisions forced upon us. And people, when they're graduate students, are often forced to, in the beginning of graduate school especially, and philosophy programs, are forced to make choices as to which side they're going to go on. Those of us in the minority who are attracted to the free market stuff found themselves, as I did, on a dog sled mushed along by this group called the Institute for Humane Studies, which tries to encourage young libertarian scholars. And I remember being mushed over towards the camp of the tent people. When I got there, I got to choose between which tent I want to join. I actually preferred this one, but whatever. Other people, and a lot of my fellow graduate students, were more the mainstream view, and they found themselves in these sort of high-powered snow machines with heated seats heading up to the camp of the high liberals. But that divide, which I think is shown perhaps most starkly at the beginning of graduate school, generates a division that plagues not just philosophy, but also, it seems to me, our popular discourse. We're forced to make choices: economic liberty or social justice, capitalism or democracy. F.A. Hayek, kind of the hero of the Tea Party to some degree, as a thinker, along with Rand maybe. F.A. Hayek or John Rawls, Tea Party or Occupy, free markets or fairness. Everybody's got to choose. I don't like it. And I haven't liked it for a really long time. And for a while, as I said, when I was in graduate school, I was just trying to figure it out, like going over there and trying to do the honest work about it. But I was also aware, like everyone else was in the conversations, that in fact, choices out here had political implications that were, to some degree, predictable in advance. And I wanted to try to think in a different way. And should I say this? I'll say this anyway. At Brown, at Brown, my students at Brown say, what I'm about to tell you is the gospel according to John. These are Brown students. What do they know from gospel? So yeah, it's not to be taken seriously. But there are a number of us who are becoming disciples of a new creed, a creed that tries to move away from this and to find a new ground, not between in the middle of the icy windswept divide, but up on the high ground that I think sort of exists up behind it on the back of the bay, a superior, higher moral ground than either of these two camps that have been set out traditionally before us. And there's different ways to do it. The way I do it is I begin up here, as I said, with my chosen tent, the classical liberal one, the Hayek one in particular, that was my favorite. My hero growing up, I suppose, as a student. I began up there, and eventually when I really started thinking about these questions out here, although I was told as a person committed to these kinds of ideas or strongly drawn to those ideas, that I ought to be one of these type of people or some variation on that, when I actually was honest with myself about how I really think is the most attractive way to begin thinking about politics, I really think this one was. You probably heard it from the way I described it. I just think this is a morally more attractive way of trying to resolve the question about how we should live together, morally speaking. I learned that in part, by the way, from undergraduates at Brown. I would try to lay this stuff out as dispassionately as I could and as fairly, as even-handedly as I could, but secretly in my heart of hearts hoping to convert some of them to come up here along with me. But I would find through the years that, in fact, thoughtful young people who are very idealistic again and again and again would find this one more attractive. And I was partly drawn by the force of that experience, encountering them again and again and again and again, to really sort of say, well, maybe this is where I am too. But I got here with a little twist. For reasons I'll describe later on, I'm really attracted to the idea of private economic liberty. And so again, just to continue the metaphor, one fine morning I crawled out of my tent and I decided to say goodbye to my old friends at Cato and other places where I used to hang out. And used to actually be welcomed. Not so much anymore. But I crawled out of my tent and I took with me, I don't know, put it in my back pocket or something, some insights, I think, some genuine moral insights from that camp about the importance of private economic liberty. And having those, whatever, in my backpack or my back pocket, I kind of ordered a little icebreaker, and I chugged my way across the status quo stuff down here. And as I approached the icy ice flow, whatever, where the igloo people live, I accelerated the boat really hard to crash into the ice where they're living, gently, because we're all friends now, we're all democratic citizens. But I want to do it hard enough, I hope, to break up the ice beneath the feet of the traditional understanding of what it means politically, what we derive from a democratic starting point, and to rethink some of those conclusions and some of those lines of reasoning. And among the questions I seek to ask my now fellow democratic citizens are things like these. Is deliberative democracy really a vehicle that can only make left turns? Kind of weird if you think about it. Just from beginning with those ideas of the citizen, the democratic citizen, why does that in itself necessarily mean, is there some mechanical reason that explains this? That you always have to turn left with your institutional approaches? Not obvious. Why is that? That's the assumption I think a lot of people have, but why is deliberative democracy a vehicle people think can only make left turns? Or, slightly more precisely, do we really best respect our citizens, our fellow citizens, as free and equal authors of their own lives by seeking to use state power to limit their private economic liberties? And I try to bring that question to my fellow democratic citizens. And when you reason that, and if you start with, if you mix those insights into this group, and by the way, I think that part of the reason why these people didn't see the importance of private economic liberty was because they too are to some degree in this trap. And the people who are actually doing the deliberating down here, who in good faith were trying to work out the requirements of democratic deliberation, happen to be people, as I'll describe in a few minutes, who tended to share a bias against private economic liberty. Partly it's explained by the chart, but it's also just, I think, an interesting fact about the world, that when people deliberate among people who are like-minded, not surprisingly, they produce conclusions deliberatively together, one another, honestly, trying to say what we think. That has a certain narrowness about it, perhaps, or at least it may not be as wide and as encompassing of the whole citizenry as it might be. If you add the importance of private economic liberty, though, and then you reason it out using public reason style arguments, you get something like a commitment to private economic liberty, a thick and depth conception of private economic liberty as among the basic rights and liberties, and also a commitment to social justice. So that's what I want to talk with you about. So the question is going to be, how can you get an argument for economic liberty that's not going to backslide and surreptitiously bring in stuff from my old friends? How do you get, that is, a genuinely democratic argument for a thicker array of private economic liberties as recognized among the basic rights of citizens? And further, how do you get that? If you can get that, how do you get a conception of social justice that's compatible with affirming a thicker range of private economic liberties? I mean, notice the problem about that second. Notice that second problem is an important one. Usually, when we think about carving a domain of liberty for people, that's going to be a domain in which the state can't go. That is, we're going to say that's an area in which we're going to have people have a certain degree of autonomy, free of, let's say, state coercion. If we extend the different domains of private freedom, where the state can't go or should tread only lightly, to include economic issues, or this is a significant array of economic issues, we're going to tie the hands of, let's imagine, well-meaning legislators who are trying to pursue social justice. And as you know, they traditionally have been pursuing social justice by moving stuff around, spreading stuff around. So if we're going to affirm, if you can get a democratic argument for economic liberty, a real challenge is going to be to get a conception of social justice that's compatible with affirming social economic liberty. What's more, secretly, what I want a conception of social justice that's not only compatible with affirming economic liberty, I want a conception of social justice that is morally more attractive on democratic grounds than the existing ones. I want a kind of social justice that's not just coherent and workable, but in fact is morally superior, that it in fact is the highest moral ground. So that's the ambition. So how do I do it? I do it by working through a certain idea of fairness. And here's a formulation that I like. We should regard as the most desired order of society the one that we would choose if we knew that our initial position in it would be determined purely by chance, such as the fact of our being born into a particular family. And it's worth pausing to see the power of that approach, justice as fairness. The idea is that if you want to know what institutional system would be fair, it would actually reflect our commitment to respect our fellow citizens as beings with lives to lead, and also respect the fact that we have our lives to lead, and make some sense of that complicated, two ways of seeing the world. We might imagine ourselves choosing between rival candidate regime types or rival candidate principles from a kind of a veil making us ignorant about who in particular we might end up being in that society. The veil comes down, we don't really know who we might be. That's going to that mechanism, that device of representation, is going to model our commitment to respecting our fellow citizens, the importance of our fellow citizens' lives and our own lives. I'm just curious offhand, does some of you who do philosophy know who that's from? Yeah, so it's not John Rawls. Sure, it looks like John Rawls. It's actually from 30 years before Rawls. It's Frederick Hayek. Rawls is a great rival. He talks about it in a book called The Mirage of Social Justice, and Hayek tells the story. Again, Rawls' great enemy, supposedly. Not really, by the way. Hayek tells a story about in 1940. He was a young parent living in London during the bombing. I think he was 39, something like that. And as the bombing got worse, he started to realize, this bomb might kill my kids. So he started sending letters to people around the world saying, look, can you take my kids and find some family for them in case I get killed? And as the bombing got worse, he realized, in fact, there's a good chance he might be killed. So in fact, whatever family his kids went to, he couldn't even be assured that they'd have the advantage of having a Nobel Prize-winning economist father to support them in that new life of theirs. Not that I had any reason on earth to think in 1940 did he ever become a Nobel Prize-winning economist? But anyway, they couldn't even know that. So he sort of thickens the information filter. And Hayek he says he had offers to have people relocate his kids in Argentina, Sweden, and the US. And in the end, he says, reasoning this way, he decided to choose the US to send his kids to as the most fair society under there might be. Interestingly, really, I think significantly, in a footnote, Hayek says that he chose the US because there's a partial tear in the veil he was actually operating behind. He knew one thing about his kids, that his kids were white rather than being black. That made it likely if they were sent to America, that they'd be, given the way things were in America in 1940 especially, that they'd be situated with a white family rather than a black family. And Hayek says that he didn't have that tear in the veil, he actually didn't know, he would not have chosen 1940s America as a just society. It's an unjust society, manifestly unjust society, because of the racial situation in America. I mention that not to say a Hayek, my libertarian free market hero, is cool about race. He may or may not have been. I think maybe he was. I mention it because I think it shows that, in fact, Hayek was actually running this original position in a really serious way. He wasn't just messing around with it. He was actually reasoning it. And he says that he started from this situation, this experience, reasoning about asking questions more generally, not just about his kid's placement, but about how you know what a just society is, just as Rawls 30 years later would do. And at Brown, I teach a large introductory political philosophy class where I teach a unit on Hayek, right before I do my unit on Rawls. And what I always do now is I sort of show people Hayek's argument. Then when we come to Rawls, I put it up on the board, and Rawls calls his the original position, just because I know that some student's going to say, well, if Hayek came up with it 30 years earlier, doesn't that make Rawls' position the unoriginal position? Just because I want to send a couple hundred kids out around campus calling Rawls' position the unoriginal position, because my colleague Dave Estlund, that kind of stuff really eats him up. But anyway, so I reason this way. This Hayekian Rawlsian device, and then what do you get out of it? So if you reason this kind of way, and we're asking now, what principles might we choose, or what kind of society might we choose? Well, what do we get? And I think we're going to get something about economic liberty. So let me say first thing about the first principle, then something about the second principle. How am I for time? Oh, really?
It's plenty of time.
When did I start?
35.
Oh, really?
What?
35. Okay.
Yeah.
So first principle, all right, challenge to get a democratic government for economic liberty. Then second principle, the challenge to get an account of social justice that's compatible with affirming these private economic liberties. So we'll do the first one first. So historically, the classical liberals are called classical liberals not because they are classics, I guess, but because they were first, earlier. And the early liberals, people like Hume, people like Smith, for them, it was obvious that among the most important basic rights and liberties were property rights. This is a common idea in early America, for example, at the time of the founding, that among the areas in which people have a special claim for protection, for free activity, to be free people, to be free individuals, free and equal children of God, all the Locke, is that they, among those basic rights and liberties, should be things like free speech, freedom of association, religion if you like, and property rights. But starting sometime, I sort of see it starting around 1850 or so, this really important division started happening within liberal thinking. It's a division within liberal thinking that led to the divide we see in our politics today. And the division, I see it sort of rooted in work of John Stuart Mill. Mill, who still, in my opinion, is still he's my favorite defender of freedom. I think the best defender of the importance of liberty. But Mill thought that among the domains in which people become who they are and advance themselves as progressive beings, Mill thought that economic activities are not actually part of that domain. That economic liberties, economic activities, like we do to make money, isn't essentially part of liberty, properly understood. And his idea, I suppose, is something like this. Imagine that you apply for your a young person starting out in your career, you have no college education, let's imagine you apply for a job at Walmart. You dream of becoming a manager and then becoming rich like Sam Walton, because he works at Walmart too. You apply for the job at Walmart, you get rejected. 2 weeks later, you go back up, you get tough again, you bring your own pen this time, you write a really neat application essay, you apply, and you get rejected again. You go back again, third time, you fill out the forms, you do it all up, you look really nice, you maybe borrow a tie, you got that Salvation Army, you look really good, give them the application, and they hire you. But instead of being the manager or Sam Walton, you're going to be the greeter. So you get the job as a greeter. Now you're the greeter. You're the greeter for a while, you do the job really well because you're serious about trying to get this job and get some money for your family and make a success of your life. You eventually get moved up, and now you become the sales clerk, the person who runs the cash register. Eventually you become the manager, and so on. Mill's idea, I think, was that those kinds of workaday activities, those are things that people do not as expressions of their freedom, but rather things they do instrumentally to put themselves in a position to do the activities that freedom, properly understood, protects. So you do those things, we have to earn money and get stuff produced so that we can become free. It's not that in the earning we are free or express our freedom, it's that we do it to become free later on in another way. So too, following on that, I think there's a trajectory now from Mill to John Maynard Keynes, and in 1930, Keynes wrote this really beautiful essay. Some of you may have read it. If you're in PPE, maybe you've read it. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Have some of you read that essay? Have any of you read that essay? So can I just really highly recommend that in the next 48 hours, as well-educated people, you Google Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren and read this. It's a short little essay by Keynes. It's whatever you think of Keynes' economic policies. He's a master stylist. It's also, I think, a phenomenally important window into the mind of something like the social democratic left. In that essay, and again, you'll see as you read it, it's not even clear what genre it is. I can't tell if it's farce or economic prediction or what it might be. But in that essay, Keynes says, look, I admit, he says, it's a gloomy time right now. Markets crash everywhere, unemployment's rampant, by the way, it's going to get a lot worse. But he says, don't worry. I bring you good news, he says. Within 100 years, by the time his grandkids are around, Western liberal economies will have grown by 8 to 10 times. And my economist friends tell me that, speaking in an era before we had any kind of sophisticated work done on growth theory, it was actually a pretty stunningly prescient prediction for where Western liberal economies are. People like Deirdre McCloskey think we have way more than that, but let's say 8 to 10 is roughly where we are, maybe even now. Crucially, though, Keynes said that when that happens, by 2030, or maybe now, we'll have grown enough that the economic problem will have been solved. And he says, he gives this really assured, really nice economic history about the sort of the hockey stick, no growth, forever, then all of a sudden this spike up. And he says, when that day dawns, so the economic problem has been solved, a great transvaluation of our values can now finally occur. Because for thousands of years, I don't know, this is how he says it actually, for a long time, people have been hag-ridden by the need to produce stuff. And in the capitalist oriented, and the capitalist version of that hag-riding, people are inclined to do the things I just described a minute ago about that Walmart worker trying to do. They have to just buck up and go do hard things. They have to think more about the next generation than about their generation. They have to think about denying themselves things now so that they can have things later on. They need to spend a lot of attention and a lot of their lives developing and praising one another for having these bourgeois virtues. Saving, scrimping, being competitive, trying to have your kids get more than you had, all those sort of bourgeois virtues. When the day of prosperity arrives, Keynes says, those bourgeois virtues will be recognized as being what they always were, which is, in fact, he says, morbid neuroses. And Keynes says, I don't know how seriously, that people who, when prosperity arrives, around now, continue to cling to those dispositions and attitudes, they should be consigned to mental institutions for correction. And if you look around online for copies of that essay, you'll see that some don't have the footnotes in them. I encourage you to keep looking until you find one with the footnotes. There are 2 footnotes toward the end of the essay where he says some really interesting things about the Jews. And again, I don't know what to do with it. But he says something like, there may be this particularly hard case with this one group of people, the Jews, who may not give up these purposive activities, as he calls them. And for them, he suggests perhaps stronger measures may be required, not just mental institutions, but something more like Christianity. I don't know. I'm just giving that to you for what it's worth. So too, following along, I think, a similar line, John Rawls, writing in the late 60s and early 70s, when he does his, unoriginal position, his brilliant original position, and he comes up with a list of basic rights and liberties, we find that economic liberties appear in a much more thin, attenuated form than they would have appeared on the list of basic liberties given by people like David Hume or Adam Smith. I think for similar reasons. He thinks these virtues, these bourgeois virtues, and that are associated with these private economic liberties of capitalism, are only going to be in some degree instrumentally valuable to other things like perhaps the pursuit of some distributive goals. So that's how I sort of see the world in that view. And what I do in the book is I try to think, well, can we reconceive it? Can we go back and think about, well, is there some reason why Lord Keynes, looking down his long nose at those bourgeois virtues, saw them for being so unimportant, where many ordinary people find them, in fact, being really important, where, in fact, economic decision-making is part of the very stuff of life. And part of the reason why I saw this, I sort of just had these views about economic liberty early on, just as a, if you'll allow me just to say it as an autobiographical matter, is that my family I'm from a family that took those economic virtues as being almost the center of life. So my family is kind of aspiring. I'm from an Italian family. My grandfather came from Italy and went to northern Vermont, middle Vermont, I think as a young boy. Northern Vermont, they went there from northern Italy because there's a big quarry in town Barry, and we all lived in Southbury. And Southbury is kind of a rough town by local rural standards. There's a big quarry there. People work in the quarry. They work really hard. My grandfather went to Spalding High School, got a high school degree, which is kind of a big moment in my family's history. It was a really big thing in my family. They were surrounded by people, most of them Italian, some French, who were really spend their lives thinking about their kids and their grandkids and getting their kids ahead. These are people who bought into that American dream like maniacs. And people like me, they still think of it. My aunts and uncles still don't know what to make of me. I mean, they're very proud of me, they think. And when we have family reunions all the time, and I went to a family reunion, and right after I got my graduate degree from Oxford, and I was talking to one of my aunts, Rose Lorenzini, and Aunt Rose said to one of her friends, she introduced me to one of her friends and said, "This is my nephew Johnny. Johnny went to college." Oh. And then Rose said, "And then he went to college again." But anyway, that's just an aside. That's sort of the world that I grew up in was so different than the world that I found myself getting into when I started doing philosophy and started meeting people and having those conversations, as I mentioned, with people, at Oxford about that. They just had many of them have a really different world background. I'm not saying I just bracket it. I'm not saying that because my family has these weird views about work, therefore they're true. I'm just saying that was for me why I started thinking about it that way. More precisely, a really important literature that I started getting into when I was in graduate school that made me see the importance of economic liberty was feminist literature. I started reading 19th century feminists. Voltaire and Duclair was, in particular, really struck me this way, but others too. But one of the things the feminists said that really struck me, the feminists said, look, patriarchy can put us in a cage, a gilded cage or a glass house, and you can make that cage as nice as you like. You can have, you can set the woman up with, a little container of really nice bird seed. You replace every morning. You can change the water that she can, peck into and sip. If she falls off her swing, you can bandage up her wing and put her back on her swing and sort of get her going again. But what women said, what these brave feminists said was, giving people all the gilded material means in the world, but denying them the respect they deserve as beings of the sort, or as citizens of the sort, who could in some sense be causes of that state of affairs, as a cause of there being the birdseed there, or the bandage on the wing and so on, disrespects them fundamentally. And by piling on more goods to them, by the patriarchs treating them ever more nicely, and stacking up more and more good stuff for them in that cage, that doesn't change the fact that if you deny people the chance to be, in some sense, causes of their lives in the economic domain, you fundamentally disrespected them. Patriarchy did that to women, no matter how much stuff they give them. And my idea is to take that feminist insight, that piece of the feminist insight, and turn it and train it against the moral ideals of the social democracies. That so too, perhaps, no matter how well-intentioned the patriarchs were, many of them were, by the way, right? There are a lot of women who are really angry at these feminists for saying the things that they were saying. You're disrespecting me by giving me this nice house. What? A lot of them thought that was just crazy. And the patriarchs thought, well, we're doing stuff for you. What's this problem? I don't get it. So too, the motives of the people who are doing the glass cage building do not get to determine whether what they're doing is right or not. What determines whether what they're doing is right or not is an evaluation of the moral experience, the lived experience, of the people who are in the cages, in those nice houses, having their wings bandaged. And one of the things I learned from the feminists was there's some important part of becoming a cause of our lives. And this is not just the simple, Tea Party Obama thing. Oh, you didn't build that. Oh, yes, I did. And I think Obama's kind of right on that. You didn't build it the whole thing. Come on, he's serious. But is there an insight in the Klan that you built it? I think there is. People build stuff and it matters to them. Again, my grandfather got out of the quarries and started a fruit stand. It was a big thing in my family. They started this fruit stand. He couldn't afford a monkey and an accordion, like you're supposed to have if you're an Italian person with a fruit stand. Oh, if he could have, he would have done it in a minute, no doubt, just to sell more fruit. But these are really big moments, because he's doing it himself. He's becoming a cause of things changing for him. So too, more parochially, again, I'm sort of doing this in a soft way, but teaching at Brown also really taught me something about this. Because at Brown, maybe I don't know if this is true here or not, but at Brown, kids are incredibly happy. I mean, it's almost like cloying how happy they are. But I noticed this thing. So these kids would come bouncing into my office as freshmen and sophomores, even if they're junior year. And, they can take anything they want. They're always changing their majors. Well, I'm going to do neuroscience, they come in and say when they first arrive. I'm going to do neuroscience and poetry, double major. But, by junior year, they decided, no, it's going to be, African art history or something like that. And they're happy as could be. But I noticed this thing happens to them. This sort of change starts to come over them as they turn, mainly, especially when they become seniors. And around this time of year, they're starting to get a little tension in their jaw when they come to my office that I really look at and find very interesting and instructive. And what's happening is they're now, for the first time in their lives, actually looking out at the future, and they're thinking, guess what? If I do major in semiotics, or wherever it's going to be, or given that I majored in semiotics, or whatever it might be, and I'm facing a choice now. I got a job opportunity, perhaps, to have an interview at Goldman Sachs, or I could go pursue my dream to start up my, microfinance loan thing for some group of people that have not yet been given microfinance loans while making no money, or whatever it might be. This is actually going to now sort of affect my real life in some long-term way. And I'm starting now to make these decisions about that they see are going to ramify down the line on themselves and on the opportunities they're going to be able to provide their children. And what they're doing, and it's sad to watch, but it's also wonderful to see, is they're slowly becoming adults. They're becoming adults precisely the way those feminists talked about, becoming authors of their own lives, in part because they're taking on economic questions. I'm not saying it's only about economic questions that we become adults or become respected as adults, but I think it's an extremely important component in becoming an adult that one takes on those economic questions. Economic decisions about saving and spending, for example, whether to take advantage of a sale to buy a television set that you want now, or to save the money because you think that your young children might want to afford separate rooms for young children down the line in a few years. Those kinds of decisions, ordinary decisions about an economic life. How much to save for retirement, how much to spend on things you want to have, those kinds of questions. They force us to think carefully about the relationship of the person we are now to the person we're going to become in 10, 20, 30 years. That kind of thinking about the relationship between those two people is, I think, in some sense, the very essence of adulthood. That's a very informal way of saying that we're trying to motivate the idea that there's something extremely important about private economic liberty. I think you can take those general ideas I just mentioned and work out an argument in a more formal way to get something like a thickened up list of economic liberties, as recognized as among the basic rights and liberties. I can say more about that later on. On to the next point. Well, let's say you do it. Let's say that you could take those sort of soft ideas I just mentioned and work up a democratic argument for economic liberty. What about social justice? So now, we're going to have the state recognizing some domains of activity, economic domains of activity, regarding working, regarding saving, regarding ownership. That's going to, the state cannot be involved without infringing upon liberties. So how can you get a conception of social justice, a genuine expression of this commitment that in a decent society, no group should be left behind, that in a decent, just, democratic society, everyone should have not just a formal chance, but a real chance to make something of themselves? How can you realize that important ambition from the high liberal tradition, given that we're going to also respect our fellow citizens and refuse to allow the state, refuse to use the state to bully them around in their economic lives? Or put the other way, we're going to tie the hands of well-meaning, let's imagine, legislators. So first, a question that's familiar to philosophers, but it's going to sound a little weird maybe to some of you who don't do philosophy, but it's a really important question. A question is, what is justice a property of? Right, so if you get this device representation going, and let's say what comes out of it is going to be a kind of a theory of justice, let's say, a kind of measuring stick. Now I'm asking, when you get that measuring stick, the question I'm asking is, what do you apply it to? So what is justice a property of? And one answer, what justice is a property of, it's a wrong answer, is that justice is a property of particular distributions in a society at any given moment. So in that view, you would do this stuff, you get out a measuring device, and you go out now to see, let's see if, say, America is just or not. We say, okay, snapshot, who's got what? And we sort of do this thing, Charles Koch, 1%, whatever they are, whatever it is, right? All these inequalities. And we say, okay, let's take the measuring stick and see whether that's just or unjust. There's a bunch of reasons why that can't be what justice is a property of. And some of his early work, John Rawls, explained that if you think of justice as being designed to do that job, to be a property of distributions, then there'll be no solution to what the metric's going to look like from this kind of a position. You just can't figure it out, in part because, I think, people are living and moving around and doing stuff. So if you're trying to get a device that's going to apply that way, it's just going to be indeterminate. You'll never get the device. Nothing will come out of this machine at all. When you crank the handle, you'll just get question marks falling out. A more dramatic way to say maybe more intuitive way to say that is from Robert Nozick. And some of you might know the Wilt Chamberlain example. Some of you know that example? How many of you know it? Anyone want to sketch it? So he says, briefly, imagine you think of justice as being something like a property of distributions or patterns, as he calls them. Imagine, but he thinks, actually no one really thinks that, none of us really thinks that. Imagine you have some pattern that you think is the right one for justice, say the person, no one has more than 10 times more than anybody else, something rather, maybe everyone's equal, whatever it might be. So you make the society that way at T1, but some great basketball player rises up, LeBron James, whatever, Wilt Chamberlain. He goes out and plays basketball, but Wilt Chamberlain says, I want a little extra money, he'll come to see me. People have to decide now, am I going to go pay the extra quarter to watch Wilt play basketball? A lot of people say, yeah, I'm going to watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. I scored 100 points sometimes, way more than LeBron James. I'm not actually going to go watch this guy. A lot of people do that, some people don't. They don't really care less about the person shooting baskets into some weird thing. But other people do. End of the year, Will Chamberlain's got this big box of money. He brings this little gurney in there, and puts it on there. He walks out with it. And he's got, like, $250,000 extra. The distribution's been destroyed. And he says, well, what do we do? If we think justice is how to property distributions, it's required that we correct it all, take it away from will, give reports back to people who went to the games, did nothing to people who didn't do anything. All that stuff is going to require constant intervention in people's lives. So instead, what most people do, and this is a really important point for the theory that the interpretation I want to be giving you, justice is a property, as Rawls says, of something like institutions. Institutions viewed and evaluated in part by their long-term distributional tendencies. So Rawls is going to kind of do in this kind of ingenious way, combine some of those concerns about who's got what with a commitment to justice as a property of institutions. So the measuring stick, now, on standard left liberal theorizing, that we're going to get out of here, is going to be a property of sets of institutions, the economic system, the legal system, viewed holistically as an integrated whole, as it tends to operate, for thinking about statistical averages, let's say, through time, say over the course of a generation or two. So justice is going to be a property of institutions viewed that way. Notice that already is going to say something important in the context of an argument such as mine that's going to be advocating something like ramping up the economic liberties. Because if you're ramping up the economic liberties, you're now going to be saying something like people are going to have the power to decide for themselves whether they want to work really hard or whether they want to work less hard. We're going to put these kinds of decisions about, as society gets richer and richer, when do they start opting in for leisure rather than labor? That's going to be up to individual people to a large degree. But the important point for now is that justice is to be a property on the standard left liberal account of institutions as they tend to operate through time, across a couple generations. So, second point, and this is actually the last point, pretty much. Second point, well, what's on the metric stick? Let's say you get this, let's say you can get it, you come out of it, bonk, then you get a measuring stick. What are the hash marks? What are we going to use when we evaluate these institutions? What exactly is the content of, what's the evaluated content of our commitment to treat our fellow citizens as beings with their own lives to lead, and as being equally important, that their lives being equally important to the lives of one another? Well, one way to think about that, a simple way to begin thinking about it, is imagine two societies that tend to produce distributions. Let's say one of them is like this, where people are roughly equal. Another one, it's really unequal. And imagine just off the top of your head, if you had to say which of these two societies, sets of institutions which generate these patterns through time, is their tendency, let's say, which of these sets of institutions which generate these patterns through time, is that yours?
Yeah.
Oh. Is it going to go off?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Which sets of institutions that generate these patterns through time is more fair? Which one better reflects our commitment to respect our fellow citizens, each and every one of them, as responsible authors of their own lives? You want to guess? And you might think this one is, right? Because after all, it's kind of equal, and equal looks kind of good, you might think. But remember, in this society, and this is, let's imagine, the kind of society I'm going to be going for in a moment, an unequal society. Unequal in part because we're going to have all these crazed people who do not think or can't be drugged to believe that their economic bourgeois virtues are morbid neuroses. They just want more for their kids, and they're going to do it. And over time, again, evaluating it by the standard left liberal schema, over time, this society is going to be like this, right? Over the course of a generation or two. I mean, even I think I can't do it. Let's say the inequalities increase even more. I don't know, whatever, like this now over time. Which of these two societies better reflects our commitment to respect people as free and equal authors of their own lives? Well, this is the Rawlsian line, though there'll be a twist, as you'll see. But it's also, interestingly, there's a great YouTube video by Margaret Thatcher, I didn't even know about, because I was giving a talk at Harvard Law School, and the next day someone sent me a clip of Margaret Thatcher doing exactly what I'm doing right now. which is kind of embarrassing for me because I didn't even know that she did the exact same thing, but obviously the audience apparently all did. But Margaret Thatcher also, by the way, as an aside, when she first came to power, took a book out, put it on her table, and pounded on it, and said, "This is what we believe." That book was Hayek, The Constitution of Liberty. Yet in her final question time, which you can go to YouTube, and look up Margaret Thatcher Socialism or Margaret Thatcher's last ride against socialism. Margaret Thatcher, in her last question time, affirms John Rawlsianism. She says, "Watch my thumbs. Which society best respects our commitment?" and all those things I just said. Well, think about the least well-off people. The least well-off here are doing better off than in this society. So this society seems to satisfy something like the difference principle more than this society. This is the just society. There's some twists within that. There are lots of twists within that. But let me show you what I think generally going on, then I'll stop. This is what I think happened. I think for a long time we had this classical liberal stuff. And by we, and for a long time I mean the founding era, the Tea Party's supposedly golden era. So some of them now I guess are anti-federalists, which actually is a better view, but anyway. Looking at this, what happened was, in the last century, especially late in the last century, we had these really brave and innovative liberals who took seriously the socialist critique. Right? That critique that says having formal rights without stuff is a kind of a sham. If you have a right to have tea at the Ritz, but you can't afford to go to the Ritz, being told you have the right to have tea there don't help you very much. So these people said, justice should include a distributive element. And they worked out a whole bunch of theories of social justice. People on the right, of those 10 people, my friends in the tents, got very upset about this. They said, these conceptions of social justice, they're evil. They have to be stopped. And so a lot of people, classical liberals and libertarians, just thought they had to be opposed to social justice because social justice, as it was served up to them, to all of us, had a particular characteristic. It was not social justice that we got, or that we have now even. All the theories, I'll just say that, all the theories of social justice that we have happen to be, it turns out, in one school, one possible school, not the only possible school. I'll describe the features of the school in a moment, but my idea, this is the main idea of free market fairness, is that we have the possibility now of developing a whole range of alternative approaches to social justice that I call market democratic. I call this social democratic mainly because these are both democratic. That's what I want to emphasize. Whether that's the right term, I'm not so sure, but that's what I call them for now. But these are all the theories that, if you're in a class learning theories of social justice, you're learning this as social justice. But in fact, what you're being taught is one approach to social justice only. Another approach to social justice, the one that I'm recommending that we start developing, what I see as sort of the undiscovered country for democratic theorists of the next 50 years, are theories of social justice that give private economic liberty and the liberty interests people have in economic decision-making their due, their proper due. And I call them market democratic, and I work out one particular one, my personal favorite one, which is a closely Rawlsian one, and I call it free market fairness. But the idea is that there'll be two features here that are going to distinguish these views. First, we're going to identify basic rights and liberties in a slightly different way. These schools tend to identify and recognize and affirm only a very, what I call a thin conception of private economic liberty. For Rawls, for example, regarding ownership, Rawls recognizes the right to ownership of private personal property only. But there's no basic right to private ownership of productive property. Thus, on the Rawlsian perspective, you can achieve social justice within a socialist economy of a certain kind, a democratic socialist economy. And they also affirm a right to freedoms of occupational choice, but very thinly described. Different people can't carve this out slightly differently, dwarfing is a little more thickly. But my thought is that over here are people who, like me, are thoroughly democratic in their approach and in their commitments, and are willing to follow the arguments of democratic public reason wherever they lead them, but who think that, in fact, the appropriate construal of basic rights and liberties and the grounds and domains of freedom include a significantly thicker range of economic activities than those people thought. So one difference is, on the first principle, these guys, but not those guys, recognize these guys, me guys, Maybe some of you guys. Recognize a thicker range of private economic liberties. There's also differences about the difference principle. For a variety, when I did this sort of stuff before, that was concealing a lot of stuff in there. I was assuming something like that the metric of benefiting at least well off is something like an economic metric, material stuff. So in the no or slow growth economies that Mill, Keynes, and Rawls seem open to, they get this roughly. And the fast-growing, market democratic, let them go crazy and be propulsive as they want societies, more, better, wilder stuff all the time. It's like this. That difference, at least, and I wash my thumbs, that's all on the assumption that the metric they were measuring for benefits is something like material wealth. But, as some people have pointed out, there can be alternative interpretations of what that metric should be. The metric is going to be actually something like a complex index of primary goods that can weight in different ways. And one of the reasons why the Rawlsians, I gather, this is something I think Samuel has worked on, one of the reasons why Rawlsians think that a stationary state could achieve the difference principle is it could maximize benefits to at least well off over time, even with eschewing, these crazy propulsive people, is because they think the index of primary goods, the elements regarding positions and powers of authority, should be given greater weight than wealth. That's why they think, for example, in a democratic workplace, you can respect people by giving them control of their workplace, even if that means less wealth. That, I'm going to close with this. That poses, I think, a pretty stark challenge. It's a challenge that I'm actually very comfortable with posing. Because so long as this was the only conception of social justice on the board, these theories, they've got the high moral ground. But once you get a rival conception of social justice put up on the board as a possibility, we now start looking at both sides a little more critically. We're going to start asking ourselves, well, how attractive is it really to think this way? Is this really the best way to respect our fellow citizens as free and equal authors of their own lives? For example, if we say that we benefit people by denying the opportunities for greater wealth, but by giving them instead more opportunities to go to meetings and to rule one another by committee vote, then we're saying something that we think is most important in life, what respect actually means. It's an interpretation of respect. Alternatively, you can say, as I say, that we respect people, on the difference principle side of things, by maximizing the share of wealth personally controlled by the lowest paid working class. Try to develop a society that maximizes their wealth. I have a lot more to say about that, but I'll stop there and we can talk about it if you like. Thank you. So,
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, good. I have to go, so I'm running first. All right. So I wrote it down. Just
Wait a minute, is this like a hit and run?
Yeah, it is. I'm so sorry. I have a meeting in like 15 minutes.
Then don't have.
So, I was interested in your using the example of the 19th century feminists as for the importance of economic liberty.
Yeah.
Because one of my critiques of that view of feminism is that you have a society, and there are lots of societies in which women are the ones who do control the economic assets and control finances.
For example, if you think about the studies that show a very high percentage of advertising dollars are directed at women, not men. And in our society today, women are sometimes very controlled the economy because they're the ones who are marketing to. Is that what you mean?
No, I was actually thinking more theological.
Oh, okay.
It
is true, by the way.
Yes, it is. But so I was thinking of a society in which women are expected to earn money, they manage finances, they manage a household, and then the men spend all day studying.
All day what?
Studying. So,
Cool.
yeah, wouldn't that be a great society?
I don't know anybody like that.
Really? Well, you should go to Lakewood, New Jersey. It's very close enough.
I do know people like that.
And this is what we see in, like, if you in theology, the psalm that I think is translated "woman of valor," virtuous woman. But we still have that women are oppressed in these societies, even though they have full economic liberty. They control all the finances, and they're oppressed because nobody cares about economic liberty in those societies.
Sorry, are these real societies you're thinking of?
Yes.
Can you just name one?
Hasidim?
Yeah.
This is how a Hasidic society
Yeah.
operates.
Yeah, yeah.
The men study at the
Yeah.
kollel.
Yeah. I was thinking more parochially. Okay.
Okay, sorry. And the women earn the money and things like that.
Yeah.
So it seems like a society that values studying over economic liberty.
Yeah.
And we have such societies.
Right.
This wouldn't apply. What
Right,
we
right,
really want to do is emphasize, everybody's right to study.
Yeah.
Which then leads to the idea that, well, it turns out that all these values are socially conditioned anyway.
What was the last part?
All these values are socially conditioned. So if we have
Sounds like a non sequitur.
no, if we have variability in what we value
Yeah.
and what constitutes freedom, right? Why should we assume that what constitutes freedom for us and what's important for us is what should be important for us?
Yeah.
And so why should we, when we're a deliberative method, why should we be keeping all those values?
Yeah.
Which is to say, why aren't we Marxists? So that seemed like non sequitur. So if you look at it from a more radical point of view, you could say, well, do these values actually lead to human flourishing?
Right.
Which is something along the lines of what Marx is doing,
Okay.
and what radical feminists also do.
Can I give you a democratic response to that?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So, I think from the democratic perspective, we think that our fellow citizens have important autonomy interests to make decisions themselves about the composition of their lives. And if we have some class of citizens in a community, say, who are denying another group of citizens, say they're women, the chance to actually for themselves decide the composition of their lives, then we're running afoul of democratic values. So my argument about the importance of economic rights and liberties is not a libertarian one. These are which you could compare as being, these are the only important liberties, and whoever has them has freedom. Don't mean that. I don't think libertarians actually said if you're forced to do it, I'm not sure they would think that either, by the way. But rather, here's the important point: we want to have a scheme of rights and liberties that are going to allow people, because these different domains of now choice are available to them, to determine the composition of their lives to themselves to some important degree. It'll be within a structure of a society, but we don't want people forced to do one thing and nothing else. Anyone who's forced to do that, we'll say, is unfree. That does not undercut my argument for the importance of private liberty as a component of a free person's properly recognized domain of decision making.
Well,
I'm simply adding that ingredient.
but that ingredient was already there in Rawls. You're saying
No.
we should emphasize it.
You can tell me. So you can have thinner conceptions of private economic liberty,
Right.
or thicker ones.
Okay.
My thought is that we can thicken them, and when we thicken them, lots of things in the theory start to change.
Okay.
For one thing, you get a more tight account of the different principle.
Or I just had one more little point, which was that Adam Smith actually did not think that free market would make us happy. He thought that division of labor stifles human flourishing and makes us unhappy.
Yeah, he was really worried about that.
He was really worried about that.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah,
Just
and-
worried
and-
about claiming him.
No, it's cool. No, well,
That's all I wanted to say about that.
he was certainly worried about that, and he advocated public support for education in part for that reason.
Yes.
Thank you. Back there.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. About 6 months ago on Winning Heart Libertarians, Mike Munger wrote an essay advocating what we call Hayekian socialism, and he said that this would include both basic income insurance and a single-payer healthcare insurance. And I was just wondering if that fits in with your market understanding.
Basic income, yes. Single payer, I'm not so sure. But so on the approach that I'm describing, economic rights are going to be justified, for example, to ownership, only on public reasons terms. And we're going to be evaluating at least some range of questions about economic rights, the ones that affect us as agents. As an agentic level, we're thinking about our basic rights and liberties, then there can be systemic level evaluation, where we think these more broad, after we address the agentic questions people have, their liberty interests connected to basic rights and interests, then there can be the systemic level, where we ask questions about how should we structure institutions to realize the second principle, for example. So, on my approach, the approach that I'm describing to property rights, we get a public reasoned only account or way of evaluating claims people make, for example, to have rights to their pre-tax income. So there's this big debate, or was a big debate. Libertarians sometimes say things like people have a right to their pre-tax income, the money they make. Libertarians sometimes say, yes, all of it. If you're a self-owner, you can kind of run out there. Don't get off my feet, I own this stuff. Social Democrats tend to think that those questions are going to be wholly solved, or almost wholly solved, through a kind of collective decision together. My view is intermediate. I think that there's a reasonable question about agentic concerns people may have with respect to their holding on to stuff they earned before their taxes. I think people have strong liberty interests and something they're owed as a matter of respect as equal citizens to a lot of their pre-tax income. But I also think that people who want to say that as a matter of basic right, they can't be taxed, those arguments get weaker and weaker and less plausible from a public reason perspective the more income the person makes, for example. So I think higher wage earners, on my approach, could not plausibly say, these taxes you're imposing upon me, on my pre-tax income, are disrespecting me as an equal citizen. That makes available, in my view, a significant pool of money, let's say, that can be used to try to support the whole scheme of justice, including things like the guaranteed basic income. And so there's a short book by Charles Murray called Libertarianism something or other, that's a few years ago. It's a really nice short book, and he proposes, it's like Milton Friedman's, but it's a little more dramatic. He says, let's scrap all these paternalistic components of the welfare scheme, like food stamps. I think it's a horrible program, paternalistic program, and instead give everyone money every month. You give them it's not means tested. They just get whatever it is. For Murray's formula, $12,000 a month. Some people blow it on stuff. We don't care. We give it to you again the next month. Keep hitting with it every month, no matter what, because you're a fellow democratic citizen. But the idea, I think, Murray said this. I think what he's thinking is, we're kind of saying to our fellow citizens, we respect you, but what's more, we want you to be engaged in the economy. We want you to become part of this productive thing we're doing, and we're going to hit you with cash again and again and again until you die, in the hopes you might actually join us and become a productive member. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but please.
This is from a long time, and I'm looking for some clarification about your conception of the person.
Yeah.
So, like Rawls, you justify particular liberties that we should include on the basic list of basic liberties in virtue of their being necessary for the adequate development of exercise of moral powers. This is how you argue for thick economic liberties.
Yeah.
But I'm not really clear whether your conception of the person is like his or different.
Yeah.
In particular, you use phrases like responsible self-authorship, respect for the authorship of others.
Yeah.
He talks about, capacity for conception of the good, capacity for sense of justice.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like I take it you have a different conception of the person than Rawls in some ways. I just want to hear more about it. But first, I take it that it's worrisome from what I've gathered from reading your book a couple of times. So first, it seems to endorse a kind of autonomy that's really robust and potentially at odds with political liberalism. I take you to be committed to political liberalism. So you talk about things like regarding yourself as the central cause of your life, looking at your life as a consequence of your activities. And you could imagine I can imagine somebody who can agree to fair terms of social cooperation while saying, I think God's the central cause of my life, and stuff like that. Second worry is that...
that's a big one, by the way.
That is a big one, yes. Second worry is that while folks like Rawls argue that the two moral powers are necessary for social cooperation, they have a certain sort of argument as to why those two moral powers are the ones that we should conceive of citizens as free and equal as having. I don't see any such arguments in your book, so I want to hear more.
Sorry, I was watching and listening to that thing fall.
Let's hear it again. So the second difficulty is that while Rawls argues that the two moral powers are necessary for social cooperation, that's how he derives his particular version of the conception of the person with those two particular moral powers. I don't really see an argument for why you choose your two moral powers. I'd just like to hear more about that. And finally, you describe your argument as a justificatory hybrid, where I take it you're using something like a democratic citizen conception of the person, or something like a Rawlsian conception of the person, to argue for these right liberal conclusions, but I worry that you're starting with a conception of the person that these folks wouldn't agree to. So I worry that it's not really a justificatory hybrid. It's sort of a fourth camp that's completely kind of using a different conception of the person.
Okay, good. That's really good. That's really well said. So there's a long review, making that point of res publica by this guy Alan Thomas. And what Alan, you really find it interesting. He takes a lot of the points you made and runs them pretty hard. He thinks that the adjustments I'm making are not as minor as I claim that they are, or as I indicate that they are. That I am doing something significant. When I talk about authorship, he doesn't mention it, by the way, but he could have to make the point sharper. I actually talk about responsible self-authorship. And Alan thinks that basically I'm moving decidedly towards a perfectionist or ethical or comprehensive conception of justice. I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, I don't know that the claim that I add, or that I try to emphasize to get to economic liberty, the claim that it's important for people to see themselves as in some sense causes of their own, the lives they're leading, is anything different than what a mainstream Rawlsian would say. If you have a religious view that is in no sense one you came to by yourself, it seems to me that that's a proper concern from any democratic perspective. If you're working in other domains, this is how I usually run these things. That I do analysis of different rights and liberty interests. I think, well, is there something special about economic liberties that don't allow us to make these claims? I try to put the challenge to the Rawlsians to say, well, look, if you're going to use this policy of economic exceptionalism, can you justify it in some way? And I think it seems plausible to me that in most of those domains that we recognize as being liberty interests, there's something like causation. And when things as a cause, that's an ingredient there too. So if someone could show me that adding pointing to the importance of the causal role in an economic domain is different than including the causal element in the other domains where we protect great liberties, then maybe that would stick. But I don't see the argument for it.
So I would take it to be something like this. When you're able to form and revise and pursue a conception of good, you could say something like, oh, you can be agnostic as to what's the cause of you doing that. You can regard yourself as acting under the idea of freedom or something like that.
Yeah.
Or you can conceive of yourself as free, or you could conceive of yourself as being like determined by God or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Similarly, I mean, I guess,
Yeah.
that's the sort of line I could see somebody making.
Can I just try that first?
Yeah,
So
sure.
I really like that. It's really cool. Maybe it helps me with something else. Another problem I have. There's lots of problems. What about people who inherit a lot of money?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So are they causes of their lives?
Yep.
Some people I know who inherited some money. I got to know them, teaching France. They think that it's really important that they spend it and give it away right. And some of these people define themselves by giving it away. Now, are they causes of their having the wealth? No, they just got it. They're, as one of my friends says, lucky sperms. Sorry. But given that, does causation play some role in the way they spend it? Might. Didn't help. Maybe there's something about causation and production that I should separate. Maybe there's some element of being. I'll just use the word cause for a minute. Of one's having religious views, intellectual views, relationship to people, economic stuff. That's going to be separate from another element that's involved with being an economic cause. And I'm kind of running those two together a little bit. If that were true, then what I'd want to do, to not do anything special with economic liberty, I don't want to do something special with economic liberty in there. If I do that, then either I have to say I'm doing something special for all the rights and liberty, that's what the res publica line says. They say it's fine to do it that way. They think it's better actually than the Rawlsian way. Or I have to say, look, I'm doing something different with economic liberty, therefore, this is not, what I try to run the book is it's the same.
So I'm not sure what to say about that. I think it's a great question, and I haven't figured it out.
Could you?
And I also just really don't know. I'm delighted to read that piece in Res Publica. And if you thought of it, just send me an email with what you thought about it, because he does what you just did. And I just don't know what to do with that. I don't. Is it clear that that divide between the political liberalism and the ethical liberalism? It's a difficult divide. My first book was about that a lot, and I was really struck by some of this, especially in civic education. That line starts to get really thin. Eamon Cowan's work in civic education really sort of made me wonder what that distinction is really going to amount to. So I don't know.
Other part of the question, and then I'll shut up, is...
No, this is great.
So this stuff, part of it was that Rawls, it seems like he gives an argument as to why we should include these two moral powers. It's not just that a lot of people take him as saying that we just conceive of ourselves as having these two powers, but it's more that this is what's necessary for social cooperation. So there's something of an argument there for why we should use these two moral powers rather than, we could fill in the blanks of the two moral powers or however you want to conceive of the person's moral powers in some other way. And I'm wondering if you have
the powers are worked out directly with respect to social cooperation.
Yes. So that's the basis for those two moral powers, is that you need to have a capacity to pursue your own good, and you need to be able to have a capacity to abide by fair terms of cooperation.
Yeah. So as you know, there's lots of people who kind of work out variations on the two powers. Rousseau does, Kant does, Rawls does. I don't know. I guess maybe I don't know. Who knows? I guess I go with authorship in part because it made the pathway to showing the importance of economic liberty more vivid to me. Is that just a device of exposition merely? That's what I would like it to be. Or does it get me involved in the thicker stuff that you're talking about? I'm not sure. And again, like I said, if it does get involved in the thicker stuff, like it might, I'm not entirely convinced that's bad.
Yeah, I guess I would think if it gets you involved in the thicker stuff and the kind of argument you're going to be giving, and your conceptual space relative to these other folks is going to be different, because you're going to need to convince them to buy into your thicker conception of the person and give up on political liberalism as they conceive it.
Yeah, good. You can think of it that way.
Yeah.
Or that's right. That's inside the profession, right?
Yeah.
Or you can think of it sort of a little more broadly. Here's an account of our democratic commitments that's going to involve some of the thicker stuff. Here's at least among the range here is going to be at least one Rawlsian one, let's imagine, that is not going to include as much. It's going to be more purely political, a more purely political conception of justice, let's say, thinner maybe. Then I think, well, which of those is more attractive? Again, it's not. I don't see my brief as convincing all the Rawlsians to come this way. My objective is to show that, in fact, this happens to be a school rather than social justice. And I show that it's a school, or I try to show that it's a school, by trying to set up a contrast class that's plausible. And what's more, I hope to show, I believe actually, that this class is more attractive. But convincing the people in that school, that's not the test. But I love that's really great. Please.
So I guess my question was about the deliberative stuff.
Yeah.
And so we need to respect people as responsible self-authors.
Yeah.
And for some people, responsible self-authorship is going to mean directly involving in some economic activity. Whether that's like your grandfather or my grandfather or Amy and the pup and the cub.
Oh, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder about like the limits of this stuff.
Yeah.
Perhaps like not like practically speaking.
Limits of what stuff?
Well, I'll explain. So say that we had a population of 100, right?
Yeah.
And then one of these people has like some commitment to economic activity as part of their responsible self-authorship. Then
They make a big part of their lives.
right.
Yeah.
And so would we then be pushed toward the market democratic system or toward free market fairness in virtue of having that member in the population, such that we're not disrespecting any member of the population?
So I think we want to try to respond to the kinds of Rawls and stuff. We want to kind of respond to the kinds of pluralism that are likely to arise within societies that reflect these institutions. And so the kinds of diversity forms of reasoning, sort of Charles Darwin stuff, and all stuff. And that's what we need to care about. When I talk about the Amy's pub in the hub example, which I've been bashing around for a long time, people didn't seem to think that's something by the economy. The economy of Amy's pub in the tub. I actually use that example in a really narrow way, and I contrast it with this guy Terry who goes out and campaigns door to door. A colleague of mine went to Ohio, knocked on doors, and tried to vote for Obama. It's actually a really bad spokesperson for Obama. We were campaign a lot. Actually, so the examples of those examples were not meant to be examples of how economies work or how democracy makes decisions. It's just to show that there can be domains of activity that are incredibly important to some people's lives. Just like Terry sees the political domain of his life really important to him, Amy sees the economic domain really important to her. And if you knock them out of that domain in either way, you'd close down the social space of the society and make it less attractive. That's one way to say it. Did I answer your question or not? You're imagining a world where no one wants to own private property?
I guess what I was wondering about was sort of like the conceptual analysis itself. Just so supposing away the facts, because we're philosopher,
I'm good at that.
and we frequently do that, right? So just suppose away the facts. I'm sort of concerned about like what would be sufficient, like what would be like a sufficient number of members of a population, such that it would have to push us toward something like this.
Okay, good. That's great.
And then I was asking, is it like 1%?
Okay, that's great.
Or maybe
no, 0. It's 0%. So this is how I think of this. And this might be just completely wrong, but just how I think of it. I think one of the things, there's an asymmetry. If we think about, so one of the questions you might ask about the basic rights and liberties is there a basic right to, what basic right should there be to ownership? We can think about economic liberties divided into a broad category of ownership powers, and say something like one's of labor and focus on ownership. I think there's an asymmetry about what's opened up by affirming or not affirming a right to private ownership of productive property. In a society that does not affirm a right to private productive property, there's the lively possibility of a democratic decision being made through flourishing institutions in the society and history and so on, that they don't allow private property at all. If there arises people in that society who want to start their pub in the tub or whatever it might be, more sensitive examples, they'll be outlawed, they'll be allowed to do that. In the market democratic society that I have, by affirming a right to private productive property, ownership of private productive property, I think one of the things we do that makes us attractive is we make, especially as welfare is rising, this starts to get interesting. We make possible a wider range, it seems to me, of workplace ownership structures that people might choose to be involved in. They can work within privately owned firms, wage labor or owners, whatever it might be, little small shops, but more likely, let's say wage labor. Yeah. But they also can, if they band together and form cooperatives, sure. They have this right to make the choice themselves, since they have a right to private ownership. Since they have a right to private ownership of productive property, they have a right to decide themselves what are they going to do with that. I mean, you might find over here an efflorescence of these kinds of sort of spontaneously generated ways of producing and ways of working, rather than being subject to the possibility of some democratic body having the power to make a decision for us, all of us. And the vote might not go our way, or it might just go one way. So I think it's true, just our two steps, I think it's true that there's an asymmetry about recognizing a right to private ownership of productive property allows a wider range of possibilities here for people. And that also reflects something that's really important. I think it's really important that the more attractive democratic society is the one which makes possible a wider range of productive life, a wider range of productive experiences. Some worker-owned firms, some hierarchical Walmart things, some Amy Pop on the tubs, people in a free society should be able to decide for themselves. They shouldn't be bound. It's a moral mistake if we think we leave it to chance or leave it to the democratic decision-making process to decide those things for them. That's kind of my idea. Thanks for coming. Ciao. I don't know. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I guess I'm just a little bit curious how you want to carve up the category of economic liberties. One concern I can imagine kind of Marxist views that say included under the economic liberties should be a right to be included in a democratically planned production scheme, right? So and I can imagine
a right to be included.
Right, or exactly, like to be to contribute to a democratically planned production scheme.
So that's available in market democracy.
Okay, that's fine, but I'm just curious, so do you include that within an economic, that's considered an economic liberty as well, or do you want to exclude more? Yeah, so that's the main question, and I guess the question, okay.
So that's, it's not a right, but it's effectively made available in market democracy.
Right, but would it be required by the first principle?
That it be made available is required by the first principle.
Okay.
But importantly, I think, not everything's market democracy does not make social space for everything. And it's going to rule some things out. And we might decide that the things market democracy rule out make it unattractive. So, for example, one thing market democracy, well, it may rule this out. It rules out something like what you were just saying, but a little more, adding a few more phrases or a clause to it. What did you say? You being involved in a worker-owned
democratically planned production scheme.
Yeah. So now take that and say societally, so that in fact all your fellow citizens, you're part now of having the experience of living in a society where the whole productive system is all shared together. You're all doing it together. It's like the camping trip thing. And we're all doing it together. If we're going to have a couple of people off to the side who are like competitively fishing for another while we're doing this together, that degrades our experience of doing it together because they're fishing and selling their stuff to one another.
Right.
And that, you might say, well, okay, that doesn't make that available. This market democracy.
Great, exactly. So that's the kind of conflict that
people can opt out. Even if it makes it available, that is, people might all be encouraged and freely choose now to engage in those kind of productive structures. They still be opt-out right all the time, so we never know. Next morning, so I'm going to go start fishing and selling my fish.
Right.
Over here, we might say it's possible that they can require that of everyone, so they can make available what? Let's call it what it is: a coercive socialist regime.
And that's fine. That's the original conflict that I had in mind. My question is how your argument is structured. Yeah, exactly. Because my core question is what in your argument rules out that kind of socialist argument. Say, the socialist cares. I care about economic liberties as well. These are the economic liberties that I care about.
Yeah.
Right? It's an economic liberty to be part of a planned, democratically planned production scheme, right? And you can imagine an argument that kind of uses similar resources to your own that says, look, I think it's important for self-esteem that people feel part of the democratic community, right? Or you can imagine, there's part of kind of, as there's bourgeoisie virtues, there's socialist virtues, and people kind of grow up in that atmosphere, and it's really important to them to be manifest. So I'm just kind of curious, even once we get a concern for economic issues within the kind of first principle, what rules out the kind of socialist concerns that, as you recognize, would conflict with the market democratic scheme.
Good. I like that. I'm not sure what to say. My first immediate thought is, well, this may not be right. The person has to give public reasons arguments as to why that form of economic production is the one that we should, in fact, coercively, impose. And maybe that's a version of what you were asking before, too. Like, what if there's no one? If there's no enemies at all, say they're all Terrys. So I'll go where I always go when I face these kind of problems. Change it and make it religion. So everyone, let's say if this is an analogy or not, it might not be, but I'll try it. Everyone becomes a Vatican I Catholic.
Okay.
All of them. No one wants Vatican II. No one wants anything else. They're all just Vatican I. Now, does that say something about whether we should properly, as democratic theorists, recognize religious liberties of a wider or narrower sort? I don't think it says anything about that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I think it says nothing about that.
No, I think that's right. I think.
But if that's right, why is that right? Isn't it because it's not just what people happen to believe or how they happen to think they want to produce that we want to honor? We want to honor them as, authors.
Right. So that's
And
great.
authors, they write a script that can change.
So it expresses a worry that I had as well, that some of the arguments that you offered here, at least, were ones that kind of took advantage of the fact that we in our culture now do very much value bourgeoisie virtues. We very much now do value persons who make a name for themselves in the economic world. In the kind of situation in which you imagine everyone was Catholic, they'd have different. So that just makes it all the more important to withdraw from those kinds of arguments that appeal to those values, those particular conceptions of the good. Right? And so I guess it gets us back to a worry that Justin expressed about, well, to what extent is there a comprehensive conception or a comprehensive view in the background?
Yeah. Those are great comments. I don't have much to add to that. But thank you.
Thanks.
Do you want to do your rights? Whatever.
On your view, so like in Friedman, so Friedman thinks we ought to alleviate poverty, right?
Milton Friedman.
Yeah. And we should have this negative income tax rather than these various programs, like food stamps and housing, houses and such. I mean, I think there's a real problem. If you just give them cash, there's a problem with children, right? The welfare of children, that kind of thing. But the reason we give people food stamps, this is not my quote, the reason we give people food stamps, housing vouchers, is so they'll give their children a place to reside, right? But let's just say you do the income thing. Now, in his account, the reason for it is the public good. Everyone benefits from people having adequate resources, at least to subsist, right? We don't want starving people. And there, it's seen as quite low.
I'm sorry, he says he destabilize the economy.
What do you think? You have people going around breaking into houses and stealing and stuff like that. Right? It's kind of like Hobbes' argument, and this is Hayek's argument too, that we should, we don't want a destitute population because it's a public good. Now, there's no talk there of a right to a basic income or a right to a decent living.
That's right.
And I wonder, on your view, whether you can generate that, given the sort of very robust property rights that you want to say that people have, who entrepreneurs and so on have very robust rights, and so that's one question. And then if you don't have that, then this issue which Rawls really focuses on.
The question is though,
can
I get a right to a basic income?
Is there a right to a basic income, or is it just a sort of charitable? So the standard classical liberal.
And you know what I want, right?
Standard classical liberal move is just charity. It's charity. It's not a right.
I don't want that.
The problem with the charitable move is that it creates serious problems. This is one reason Rawls argues property on democracy. Serious problems against the welfare state. Serious problems of self-respect.
Yeah.
When the least advantaged are made to feel that they're a burden on society, and that they're always going to be begrudged. If it's seen as charitable, it's always going to be begrudged. People are always going to begrudge them this, and so that's one of the reasons social basis self-respect is among the primary social goods, and he takes that a long way in arguing for property on democracy. He even extends this argument to the welfare state. The difference between the welfare state. So you're looking at Hayek and Friedman as the sort of far right end of the welfare state, right? And then it gets more liberal. If you find Paris, you get a right to a basic income that's maybe double that or whatever. I don't know. You're talking about $35,000 a year as opposed to poverty level $14,000.
In addition
so on your account, I guess if it's a right, then of course, just like then you've got to, it seems to me, modify the definition of what people have a right to by virtue of their robust, basic liberty, property rights. I mean, there has to be some sort of duty, or it can't be said that you can't make this libertarian claim that they have a right to whatever they gain by market activity. Whereas there's right up front, there's a duty to pay to support public goods and other people's basic rights.
Yes.
Now, is that your position?
That's not. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
your position.
That's my position.
So it's not the case. So, I mean, I can see why the Cato Institute kicked you out. So basically, you're saying that people have a right to kind of a right to a basic income, right?
Yeah.
A right to a basic income.
Yeah, right.
And that's going to put you to the left of Obama already. Right? Well, that's a very interesting. It wasn't clear from your book about that, because that is not a move you find in the classical liberal tradition. They all want to say, most of them are utilitarians, so they don't talk about rights as much anyway.
Yeah.
In Hayek and Friedman, it's both. They make it a public good argument.
Yeah, I know.
And Hayek comes right out of Hobbes. That, we don't want these people breaking into our house at night and stuff. So we got to fund these.
It's clear, and I think it's clearer in Milton Friedman than it is in Hayek.
Yeah, well,
Hayek says
he has
different
a whole
things.
chapter to it, but yeah, the right to it. But he didn't talk about the right to it.
But Hayek says different things at different places. I mean, he's interesting that way, and especially with respect to the social justice stuff.
Yeah,
But I meant to.
Yeah.
I had these incredible letters that I just came across recently from Frederick Hayek and Jim Buchanan,
Right.
written in 1965. And Hayek is writing to Buchanan, I just got them like a week ago. And Hayek says, I've been thinking about the rules of order of just society. Then he says, the only philosopher from whom I've learned significant things about this is John Rawls at MIT.
That's Buchanan.
And that's from Hayek.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well,
It's
they
John
both
Rawls
said
at
it.
MIT. And then Buchanan writes back to say,
Yeah.
I hope he has some impact.
Yeah,
They're both really excited
they
about it.
both wrote Rawls.
Especially because of that early, the 65, the constitutional liberties.
Well, that's because of pure procedural justice.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
what Hayek was.
Exactly.
It's just he's not as prepared to
I think
taxation and transfer.
Well,
He
I
thinks
guess
the
that's right.
procedure is just the market procedure for distribution. I think that's what he thinks. But
Yeah.
that's the procedure, right?
But crucially, Hayek said explicitly that he thinks there can be a process-independent standard of moral evaluation for spontaneous market processes, including the rules that themselves involve. That's
That's
big.
because I think he's an indirect utilitarian. There is a process-independent basis, but
Maybe that's right. That's
You
understandable.
probably disagree. I know Jerry Gauss disagrees. That John Gray's,
About that reading of Hayek.
John Gray says, I think he's right, that Hayek's an indirect utilitarian.
Gupta says that too.
John Gray, who does?
Chandra Gupta.
Right, yeah. I think they're
Late one, I think so too.
right. I think they're right.
I think they're right too. But on the point you were making about on the free market fairness stuff or the market democracy stuff, I see those things about guaranteed basic income, for example, right to health care. I think those are second principle requirements of justice.
Okay.
Well, the right to health care, we're going to slice it.
So you're going to define the property right